Hi there. This is a recording as a follow-up to the town hall conversation that we had on July 23rd, 2020. It was about getting together and having a conversation about how we're doing with Messy Church now and in this time of the pandemic, and beginning to think of how we're going to go forward as we move into different phases of opening up in the pandemic. So I'm going to share with you the PowerPoint that I shared as we started our conversation so that you can see, you can be a part of our conversation as we go forward. So Johanna Myers and I went together in presenting this time. So we began with a time of prayer, a time of scripture. And I've shared this scripture earlier. It's from Isaiah 43, verses 18 and 19. I have been doing a lot of thinking lately about liminal time or in-between time. That time when you know that things are changing, but you don't know for sure what's going to happen next. Some people describe it as being a threshold moment where you step over the threshold into something new. I think of my time of pregnancy many, many years ago and how that was a liminal time of knowing that I was going to be a mother and not knowing for sure what all that would mean and getting prepared for that. And I think this pandemic has been a liminal time for many of us. Sometimes we know, we think that we know what's going to come next, and we, excuse me, we make plans for what comes next. And then all of those plans get thrown out the window. And so this verse from Isaiah 43 has been something that has helped me during this time of not knowing. Because I like to know. I think probably most of us like to know what's going to go on. And we are not able to do that right now. So from Isaiah 43, do not remember the former things, or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I shared in a blog post several weeks ago that my husband's the gardener of the family. He loves to garden, and I love to take advantage of his the beautiful yard that he plants. He planted bulbs earlier this spring, and couldn't figure out why they never showed up. All of us, he thought they should be growing, that something should be growing. And he thought maybe the squirrels ate the bulbs or they rotted or something like that. And then all of a sudden there was a green shoot that started coming up. And he realized that it had been doing what it needed to do all along underneath the ground, but he couldn't see it. So when I think of this, excuse me, I'm gonna take a drink. When I think of this time of the pandemic, I think that God is there doing new things, and we're just not able to see it yet. I've been having a difficult time, I'll be honest with you. And several weeks ago, I listened to a sermon by Nicole Riley, Reverend Nicole Riley, who is on our Messy Church USA board, and who was the person who did the training for our Messy Church when we started in 2013. And she was preaching on patience. She's been doing a series this summer on the fruit of the Spirit. And so I caught her sermon on patience. And something that she shared during that time really has stuck with me. She talked about patience being what would happen if we would change maybe our understanding of what patience is. And she challenged us to think of patience as being a learning practice. How can we think of patience as being a spiritual practice of making space for something new to emerge. It gives a different understanding of patience, where we're creating space for something new to happen. And in that, we realize that our role is to trust God, that God is already making something new. And our role is to open our eyes and listen deeply to each other and to the Spirit of God, to hear and see the new thing that might be just barely peeping out of the ground. I've been reading about liminal time in a journal that I received from Richard Rohr's Center for Contemplative and Action. And in one of the articles, Alison Barr writes that this time and this in-between time is life not as it was before, but we don't know yet how it's going to be. That's sort of what we're living in, and that's sort of where Messy Church is right now. We know that it's not going to be like it was before. That's what we knew, and that's what we loved about Messy Church, about being in relationship and being able to all be around a table together and share together. And we know that when we go back into being together in person, then it won't be the same. But we don't know what it's going to be like. So how do we live and how do we plan? And then this other quote, it was from that same article, but she quoted A.J. Russell. And I think it's a good mantra for us to live by, that when I wake up in the morning, I have no fear of the future, no cloud over the present, and no shadow of the past. So that's some of the things that I've been thinking about as I think about how we move forward in our thinking and planning of Messy Church. You know, we started in a crisis. We did such amazing work at starting different things and trying new things and experimenting. And yet we know that that energy cannot be sustained, that we're moving into a time where we realize it's not a crisis anymore, but it's a time when we have to sustain ourselves and sustain our people as we realize this pandemic is not going away and it's going to be with us for a while, and it's changing everything. So what are the possibilities then as we think about Messy Church? I think it's important that we begin always with thinking about our foundational values. Messy Church started as a on the fringe type worship for our traditional church to meet a need of people. And these five foundational values have been part of the Messy Church movement for the 16 years it's been in existence. And how can we take these values and make sure that they're part of how we move forward? How can we use them contextually in our different churches that are all in different phases of opening? The Messy Church values are all ages together. How do we do this messy work of being a beloved community with all ages, with single and married and adults and children from 2 to 70? How do we be together online or in small groups, or when it becomes possible in a larger group? How do we continue to focus on our value of celebration? How do we celebrate the wonderful things that God is doing, even if we may not experience it yet, or even if we may not see it or perceive it? How do we engage in hospitality, of creating space for people to encounter God, to encounter the love of God? How do we keep creativity as part of our core value in whatever way we move forward as Messy Church? And then how do we keep Christ at the very center of all that we do? So when we think about where we are now with Messy Church, the different ways we are being Messy Church, and we think about where we will go in the future by starting with these values and keeping these values, that will be important as we adapt and as we innovate. So what are the possibilities? There will be a time when we will meet in person again, and there are some Messy Churches that are meeting in person in different parts of the country, different parts of the world. In South Dakota, where Sandy Cole is from, they are opening their schools, they are opening their churches because their numbers are so low with the COVID. So what are the possibilities for Messy Church and getting together in person? What about hybrid? Are there ways to do online and smaller groups where we have ways to have some smaller groups gather, but then also connect with one another online? And how do we do Messy Church totally online? And then we always need to put the other there, because there's always ways that God is showing us again that God is doing a new thing. So how do we keep alert to that? So these are some of the ideas that we've talked about as regional coordinators, just sort of some brainstorming to get us thinking about what are the possibilities. In-person Messy Church. When we gather together, what would happen if instead of having the activities and all the items for the supplies for the activities scattered around the tables around in our space, but every person who came in or a group that came in together would get a box of supplies, and they would use those for all the different activities so that they could keep that in their group. What would happen if our table hosts, rather than people moving from place to place, table to table throughout our time, what would happen if people would just stay put in one space with their cohort or with their small group, and then the table hosts are the ones that move around and do the activities? How can we do Messy Church outside? There are some people who are already doing that and trying that. Do we have to start limiting how big our in-person Messy Church can be? That's really hard for us when we think about being hospitable and wanting to welcome all. But what are the possibilities? What about hybrid, online, and smaller groups together? Johanna has done a lot of work with intergenerational small groups, and we hope to have her present a webinar on that coming up within the next several months. But how can we take the values that we have as Messy Church and have small groups to get together focused on those 5 values? What would happen if we would have small groups meeting in places all at the same time, or they would be meeting with their cohort and then they would join up with other cohorts either outside or online as a way to have celebration together? Many of you have already been doing Messy Church at home bags, where you send out at home bags and people do activities together, but then you meet during Facebook Live or Zoom all together to have a time of celebration. The use of what is being called playlists, micro learning opportunities. Erin Jenkins from Epiphany Episcopal Church in New Hampshire has a great example of using that, where she created a messy adventure where she invited people to go outdoors and experience God's presence outdoors. She gave the example of the scripture of rising up on wings like an eagle. She invited people to go to the Audubon, the local Audubon area, and look for different birds. She gave a video link to eagles learning how to fly. She had the scripture that people could link to and read together as they were getting ready to go. I'll put that example up. It is on our website at messychurchusa.org. It's a great way of being together, but yet everyone does their own thing. What happens with the third possibility is totally online. And I think about the examples that we had from the 3 different churches who presented at our Messy Church Now webinar several weeks ago. One example was from Jennifer May, and she had pre-recorded everything on a Google slideshow, and then she sent out a link to the Google slideshow, and people could watch it at their own convenience, at their own time. There's also the ideas of doing a mix of recorded and live presentation, and that is what Layla Wagner shared with her example. And they all 3 people who presented let it be made known that it's always a time of adapting and changing and seeing what works well and what maybe needs to be tweaked a little bit for the future. And then Johanna Meyer shared how she sent out a supply list a very simple supply list of paper and colors. And then they did 2 activities together during a Zoom call. And then she used the origami doves that people had folded and used those in the Sunday morning traditional worship service as a backdrop of the altar for Pentecost. So there's so many different possibilities and ideas. So those are some ideas to think about as we get started and as we began our conversation. Before I end, I want to let you know that we are having another webinar coming up in August. Nicole Riley is going to be sharing about that messy patience that I talked about, messy patience in a pandemic world, exploring spiritual practices. If you're feeling stressed or overwhelmed or tired, and you need some self-care, your team needs some self-care, this would be a great webinar for you to sign up for. It will be on August 20th. At 10 o'clock in the morning Pacific time. That would be 1 o'clock Eastern time. Reverend Nicole Riley, who is the teaching pastor at Valencia United Methodist Church in Valencia, California, will be presenting. As I mentioned, she is on our Messy Church USA board. Registration is not up yet, but it will be up soon. So I will you look for Facebook posts and web blogs about when registration opens. Here's another list of resources, and I'll be putting this up with this blog post also. Some ways of thinking about how do we do this next step. Vibrant Faith. There is a website, Vibrant Faith Catalyst, that you can join. It's an online community. You don't have to pay to join to be a part of the community, but they share a lot of different classes. Several of us from the Messy Church staff and regional coordinators just took this class on playlists that I mentioned earlier. Vibrant Faith at Home. There are projects there that you can take, and also Vibrant Faith Intergenerational Sessions. I have this on a PDF, as I said, that I will post up here. Also thinking about moving forward, Christine Hyde shared in a post about planning, that it's like a teeter-totter. You're always sort of making plans, but it's always a little bit moving and shaking. And so she has a blog post that you might want to check out. And also there's another blog post from Build Faith on engaging volunteers, how we can engage volunteers during this time. I'm going to write up the notes from the group that was present at our town hall conversation, so be sure to check that out also. But I just wanted to say thank you for taking a few minutes to take a look at this ideas. If you have some ideas of how you are doing Messy Church right now, or how you're planning to do Messy Church come September, October, November, December, let us know. You can contact me at roberta@messychurchusa.org. Thanks so much, and have a very blessed day. May God be with you. May you keep your eyes open to see how God is doing a new thing, what new thing is emerging in your life and in your ministry. Thank you. Bye-bye.